Chapter 41. An Invitation for Peace. Sati, Bhagat, Chandrakatu, Mutli and Brahaspati had collected in the Lothal Governor Chinardwaj's private office. They had just received a visitor from Devagiri with a message from Kanakala. A message that had left them stunned. Peace conference? Asked Bhagat. What deception are they planning? Prince Bhagat rebuked the Lothal governor, Chinardwaj. This is Meluha. Laws are not broken here. And the laws of a peace conference are very clear. They were designed by Lord Ram himself. There is no question of there being any deception. But what about the attack on Panchavati? Asked Minli, the king of Vaishli. They have clearly found the Narmada route to the Naga capital and have sent their ships on an attack mission even as they try to sidetrack us. How is that subterfuge, King Minli? Asked Chinardwaj. They are at war with us. They found a weak spot and decided to attack. That is how wars are conducted. I don't have a problem with the Meluhans choosing to attack, Governor Chinardwaj, said Chandrakatu, the king of Branka. What is worrying is that they chose to attack Panchavati and call a peace conference at the same time. That sounds fishy to me. I agree, said Bhagat. Maybe it is a ruse to draw us out of the city with a call for a peace conference and then attack us. Without the protective defenses of the Lothal fort, we may well be beaten by the Meluhans. Prince Bhagat, said Brahaspati, we've also received word that the Meluhan army has still not marched out of Gurukapa. If their plan was to trick us out of Lothal, why wouldn't they mobilize their army at the same time? Chandrakatu nodded. That is confusing. Maybe there are divisions within Meluha, suggested Brahaspati. Maybe some people want peace while others want war? We cannot trust this initiative blindly, said Sati. But we cannot ignore it either. If there's a possibility that the Samras can be stopped without any more killing, it is worth grabbing, right? But the message is for Lord Shiva, said Bhagat. Shouldn't we await his return? Sati shook her head. That may take months. We don't even know if he has succeeded in convincing the VAYUPUTRAs. What if he hasn't? We would then be in a very weak position to negotiate a ban on the Samras. It's a stalemate right now. Even the Meluhans know that. Who knows, we might be able to negotiate good terms at the conference. We could, said Chandrakatu. Or we might just march straight into a trap and have our entire army destroyed. Sati knew that this was a difficult decision. It couldn't be made in a hurry. I need to think about this some more, she said, ending the discussion. Sati walked into the heavily guarded room. The visitor from Devagiri, who had carried Kanakala's message, had been detained in a comfortable section of the Lothal governor's office. While the messenger had been treated well, the windows of his room had been boarded up and the doors kept locked at all times, as abundant caution. He had been blindfolded while being allowed into the city and was led straight to this room. His men had been made to wait outside the city. Sati did not want the peace envoy to take note of the defensive arrangements within the city. Your Highness, said the Meluhan as he rose and saluted Sati. She was still the Princess of Meluha for him. Brigadier Mayashrinik, said Sati with a formal namaste. She had always thought well of the Arishtain my brigadier. Mayashrinik looked towards the door with a frown. Isn't the Nilkanth joining us? Brigu had decided against sharing intelligence with Daksha at Devagiri. It would only cause Daksha's unwelcome interference in war strategies to continue, which Parvateshwar, being a disciplined Meluhan, would find difficult to constantly withstand. Therefore Mayashrinik, like every Meluhan in Devagiri, did not know what Parvateshwar and Gurukapa suspected, that Shiva may have sailed up the Narmada and then marched on to Panchavati. Sati, obviously, didn't want to reveal to Mayashrinik that Shiva was not in Lothal. But she didn't want to lie either. No. But when you speak with me, said Sati, interrupting him, it's as good as speaking with him. Mayashrinik frowned. Is it that the Lord Nilkanth doesn't want to meet me? Doesn't he want peace? Does he think that destroying Meluha is the only way forward? Shiva does not think that Meluha is evil. Only the Samras is evil. And of course, he is very willing to sue for peace if Meluha meets just one simple demand: abandon the Samras. Then he must come for the peace conference. That's where the problem lies. How can we believe that Kanakala's invitation is genuine? Your Highness, said a stunned Mayashrinik. Surely you don't think Meluha would lie about a peace conference? How can we? Lord Ram's laws forbid it. Meluhans may always follow the law, Brigadier. My father doesn't. Your Highness, the Emperor's efforts are genuine. And why should I believe that? I'm sure your spies have already told you that Maharishi Brigu is in Gurukapa. So? Maharishi Brigu is the one who doesn't want any compromise, Your Highness. Your father wants peace. He has an opportunity for it while the Maharishi is away. You know that once your father signs a peace treaty, it will be very difficult for Maharishi Brigu to overrule it. Meluha recognizes only the Emperor's orders. Even now, while Maharishi Brigu may give the orders, they are all issued in the name of the Emperor. You want me to believe that my father has suddenly developed enough character to stand up for what he thinks is right? You are being unfair. Really? Don't you know that he killed my first husband? He has no respect for the law. But he loves you. Sati rolled her eyes in disgust. Please, Mayashrinik. Do you really expect me to believe that he's pushing for peace because he loves me? He saved your life, Your Highness. What utter nonsense. Have you also fallen for that ridiculous explanation? Do you really believe that my father threw out my Naga child and kept him hidden from me for nearly 90 years so he could save my life? No, he didn't. He did it because he wanted to protect his own name. He didn't want people to know that Emperor Daksha has had a Naga grandchild. That is the reason why he broke the law. I'm not talking about what happened 90 years ago, Your Highness. I'm talking about what happened just a few years ago. What? How do you think the alarm went off at Panchavati? Sati remained silent, stunned by the revelation. The timely triggering of that alarm saved your life. How do you know about that? Lord Brigu had sent the ships to destroy Panchavati. But your father sent me to sabotage that operation. I triggered the alarm that saved all of you. I did it on your father's orders. He harmed his empire and his interests in order to protect you. Sati stared at Mayashrinik, gobsmacked. I don't believe you. It is the truth, Your Highness, said Mayashrinik. You know I don't lie. Sati took a deep breath and looked away. Even if His Highness is thinking of peace only because of his love for you and not because of his duty towards Meluha, wouldn't our country benefit all the same? Do we really want this war to continue till Meluha is destroyed? Sati held her counsel, as she turned towards Mayashrinik. Please speak to the Nilkanth, my lady. He listens to you. The peace offer is genuine. Sati didn't say anything. May I please have an audience with the Nilkanth, Your Highness? Asked Mayashrinik, still unsure of whether Sati had committed herself to peace. No, you may not, said Sati. One of my guards will guide you to the city gates. Go back to Devagiri. I will give serious thought to what you have said. We should consider attending the peace conference, said Sati. She was in conference with Bharat, Brahaspati, Chinardwaj, Chandrakatu and Mentally, at the governor's residence. That is not a wise idea, my lady, said Bharat. Only Lord Ram can know what traps they may have set for us. On the contrary, I think it may be very wise Is there a good possibility that the army in Kurakapa doesn't know what my father is doing in Devagiri? It's possible, said Brahaspati. But do you actually think your father is driving the peace conference? Does he have the strength to push his way through? Perhaps it's not him alone. Prime Minister Kanakala is certainly involved, for one, said Sati. The invitation is in her name. Kanakala has influence over the emperor, no doubt, agreed Chinardwaj. And she is certainly not a warmonger. Her instincts are usually towards peace. Also, she is a devoted follower of the Nilkanth. Does she have the capability to enforce the peace accord? Asked Bhagat. Yes, she does, said Sati. The Meluhan system works on the principle of written orders. The supreme written order is the one that comes from the emperor. Lord Brigu does not issue orders himself. He asks my father to ratify what he deems fit. If my father issues an order on peace before Lord Brigu gets to know of it, all Meluhans will be forced to honor it. So if Prime Minister Kanakala can get my father to issue the order, she can enforce the peace accord. If we can achieve the objective of removing the Samras without any further bloodshed, it will be a deed that Lord Rayuta would be proud of, said Mitli. But we should respond carefully, persisted Akashas Bhagat. If it is true that peace is being pursued only by Emperor Daksha and Prime Minister Kanakala, we will put our army at risk if we march out. Kurakapa is not very far. Right, said Sati, with healthy respect for the tactical brilliance of General Parvachwar. If Baitrachalya in Kurakapa hears about our army moving out, he'll assume that we're attacking Devagiri. He'll race out of Kurakapa to intercept us at the Saraswati River. Damned if we respond and damned if we don't, said Chandrakatu. So what do we do? Asked Chinardwaj. I'll go, said Sati. The rest of you, including the army, should stay within the walls of Lothal. My lady, said Mitli. That is most unwise. You will need the army's protection to prevent any possible harm to your person in Devagiri. The Meluhans may fight with my army outside Devagiri, said Sati. But they'll not fight me alone. It's my father's house. Bhagat shook his head. My apologies, my lady, but your father has not proved himself to be a paragon of virtue so far. I would be wary of your traveling to Devagiri without protection. We cannot discount the remote possibility that the peace conference is a ruse to draw our leaders to Devagiri and then assassinate them. Chinardwaj was genuinely offended now. Prince Bhagat, I say this for the last time. These things do not happen in Meluha. Arms cannot be used at a peace conference under any circumstances. Those are the rules of Lord Ram. No Meluhan will break the laws of the seventh Vishnu. Sati raised her hand, signaling a call for calm, and then turned towards Bhagat. Prince, trust me. My father will never harm me. He loves me. In his own twisted way, he really does care for me. I'm going to Devagiri. This is our best shot at peace. It is my duty to not let it slip by. Bhagat could not shake off his sense of foreboding. My lady, I insist you allow me and an Indian brigade to travel with you. Your men will be put to better use here, Prince Bhagat, said Sati. Also, you and your soldiers are Chandravanshis. Please don't misunderstand me, but I would much rather take some Suryavanshis along. After all, I'm going to the Suryavanshi capital. I'll go with Nandi and my personal bodyguards. But, my child, said Brahaspati, that is only 100 soldiers. Are you sure? It's a peace conference, Brahaspatiji, said Sati. Not a battle. But the invitation was for the Lord Nilkanth, said Chandrakatu. The Lord Nilkanth has appointed me as his representative, Your Highness, said Sati. I can negotiate on his behalf. I have made up my mind. I am going to Devagiri. I have a bad feeling about this, My lady, pleaded Virabhadra. Please don't go. Also assembled in Sati's private chamber were Parshurama and Nandi, whose expressions were equally anguished. Virabhadra, don't worry, said Sati. I will return with a peace treaty that will end the war, as well as the reign of the Samras. But why aren't you allowing Virabhadra and me to accompany you, my lady? Asked Parshurama. Why is only Nandi being given the privilege of traveling with you? Sati smiled. I would have loved to have the both of you with me, it's just that I'm only taking Suryavanshas, that's all. They're familiar with the Meluhan customs and ways. This is going to be a sensitive conference, anyway. I wouldn't want anything going wrong inadvertently even before it begins. But, my lady, continued Parshurama, we have sworn to protect you. How can we just let you go without us? I will be with her, Parshurama, said Nandi. Don't worry. I will not let anything happen to Lady Sati. There is absolutely no reason why anything untoward should happen, Nandi. It's a peace conference. If we don't arrive at a peace settlement, the Meluhans will have to allow us to return unharmed. That is Lord Rem's law. Virabhadra continued to brood silently, clearly unconvinced. Sati reached out and patted Virabhadra on his shoulder. We must make an attempt at peace, you know that. We can save the lives of so many. I have no choice. I must go. You do have a choice, argued Virabhadra. Don't go yourself. I'm sure you can nominate someone to attend the conference on your behalf. Sati shook her head. No. I must go. I must. Because it was my fault. What? It was my fault that so many of our soldiers died and Devagiri and our elephant corps was destroyed. I'm to blame for the loss of almost our entire cavalry. It is because of me that we do not have enough strength to beat them in an open battle now. Since it is my fault, it is now my responsibility to set it right. The loss in Devagiri was not your fault, my lady, said Parshurama. Circumstances were aligned against us. In fact, you salvaged a lot from a terrible situation. Sati narrowed her eyes. If an army loses, it is always because of the general's poor planning. Circumstance is just an excuse for the weak to rationalize their failures. However, I have been given another chance to make up for my blunder. I cannot ignore it. I will not. My lady, said Virabhadra. Please listen to me. Bhadra, said Sati, using the name her husband did for his best friend. I am going. I will return unharmed. And with a peace treaty. Chapter 42. Kanakala's Choice. The invitation for the peace conference had been accepted. Kanakala rushed to Daksha's private office the minute she received a bird courier from Lothal. The door attendant tried to stop her, saying the emperor had asked him not to let anyone enter. Kanakala brushed him aside. That order would not have included me. He asked me to meet him as soon as I receive this, said Kanakala, pointing to a folded letter. The door attendant moved aside and Kanakala heard whispers as soon as she opened the door. Vidimali and Daksha were speaking softly with each other. She gently shut the door behind her. Are you sure they are ready? Asked Daksha. Yes, my lord. Swathsmen have been practicing in Naga attire. That fraud Neelkanth won't know what hit him, said Vidimali. The world will blame the terrorist Nagas for their beloved Neelkanth's assassination. Daksha suddenly stopped him as he noticed a shocked Kanakala rooted at the entrance. Vidimali drew his sword. Daksha raised his hand. Vidimali. Calm down. Prime Minister Kanakala knows where her loyalties lie. Your Highness, whispered Kanakala, her eyes wide with terror. Kanakala, said Daksha with eerie calm, walking up and placing his hands on her shoulders. Sometimes an emperor has got to do what has to be done. But we cannot break Lord Ram's laws, said Kanakala, her breathing quickening with nervousness. Lord Ram's laws on a peace conference apply to a king, not to his prime minister, said Daksha. But. No buts, said Daksha. Remember your oath. This is wartime. You have to do whatever your emperor asks of you. If you reveal his secrets without his permission, the punishment is death. But, Your Highness, this is wrong. What will be wrong is for you, Kanakala, to break your vow. Your Highness, said Vidinmali. This is too risky. I think the Prime Minister should be. Daksha interrupted Vidinmali. We are doing no such thing, Vidinmali. If we don't have her here to organize the conference, Shiva's men will get suspicious the moment they arrive. It is, after all, the conference of Kanakala. Kanakala was speechless with horror. You have been loyal to me for decades, Kanakala, said Daksha. Remember your vows and you will live. You can continue to be Prime Minister. But if you break them, not only will you be given the death sentence, you will also be damned by the Paramatma. Kanakala couldn't utter a word. She knew that the prime ministerial oath also said that if she betrayed her liege, no funeral ceremonies would be conducted for her. According to ancient superstitions, this was a fate worse than death. Without funeral rituals, her soul would not be able to cross the mythical Vaitarni River to Paitralak, the land of one's ancestors. The onward journey of her soul, either towards liberation or to return to earth in another body, would be interrupted. She would exist in the land of the living as a Pishak, a ghost. Remember your vows and do your duty, said Daksha. Focus on the conference. Kanakala stood quietly on the terrace outside her home office. She loved the sound of trickling water from the small fountain in the center of the chamber. This sound was wafting gently towards her, all the way to the open balcony. It kept her mind focused and calm. She looked up, the sun was already on its way down. She took a deep breath and looked towards the street. The soldiers weren't even trying to hide. Kanakala did not feel any anger towards the men who kept watch outside her house. They were good soldiers. They were simply following orders given to them by their commander. Kanakala knew it was pointless to try and send a message to Lothal and warn the Nilkanth. She was sure Vidinmali would have positioned expert archers along the route to bring down any bird courier. Furthermore, it was very possible that the Nilkanth's convoy had already left Lothal. Her only recourse was Parvateshwar. If Lord Brigu and he managed to reach Devagiri in time, this travesty that her emperor and Brigadier Vidinmali were planning could be stopped. But getting a message to Karakapa wouldn't be easy. Kanakala looked at the small message in her hand. She had personally addressed it to the Nilkanth. She rolled the message tightly and slipped it into a small canister attached to a pigeon's leg. She shut the canister, closed her eyes and whispered, "Forgive me, noble bird. Your sacrifice will aid a greater cause. Om Brahme Namah." Then she threw the bird into the air. She could immediately sense the soldiers below go into a tizzy. She saw an archer emerging from the rooftop of a building some distance away. He quickly loaded an arrow onto his bow and shot at the pigeon, hitting the bird unerringly. The stricken pigeon dropped like a stone, with the arrow pierced through its body. The soldiers quickly scattered to find the pigeon. The message would be taken to Vidinmali instantly. It would appear genuine since it was in Kanakala's handwriting and had been addressed to the Nilkanth. Kanakala looked towards the street once again. From the corner of her eye, she saw her servant slip quietly out of the side door, using the temporary distraction of the soldiers with the fallen bird. The servant would release a pigeon outside the city walls, a homing bird set for Karakapa. Kanakala hoped Brigu and Parvateshwar would be able to arrive in Devagiri in time to stop this madness, to prevent this subversion of Lord Ram's laws. Subsequently, the servant had been instructed to ride hard southwards towards Lothal, and attempt to stop the Nilkanth and his peace negotiators from walking into a trap. Kanakala had done all that she possibly could. The Prime Minister sighed. She had broken her vow of loyalty to the Emperor, but she sought solace from an ancient scriptural verse, Dharma Madhugurta, Dharma is that which is well judged by your mind. Think deeply about Dharma and your mind will tell you what is right. In this case, it appeared to Kanakala that breaking her vows was the right thing to do. For that was the only way to stop an even bigger crime from being committed. But she was no fool. She knew her punishment. She would not give Daksha that pleasure. Though. Kanakala smiled sadly and walked back into her office. She stopped at her writing desk and picked up a bowl, which contained a clear, greenish medicine that had been prepared recently. She swallowed it quickly. It would numb her pain and make her feel drowsy, exactly what she needed. She ambled up to the fountain. The small pool at the base of the fountain was perfect, deep enough to keep her hands submerged. Clotting would be arrested if the wound was continually washed by flowing water. She picked up the sharp ceremonial knife that she carried on her person. For one brief moment, she wondered whether she would roam the earth forever as a ghost, if her funeral ceremony was not conducted in accordance with the prescribed rituals. Then shook her head and dismissed her fears. Dharma Rakshati Rakshataha, Dharma protects those who protect it. She shut her eyes, balled her left hand into a fist and submerged it in the water. She then took a deep breath and whispered softly, Jai Shri Ram. In a swift move, she slashed deep, slicing through the veins and arteries on her wrist. Blood burst out in a rapid flood. She rested her head on the side of the fountain and waited for death to take her away. It doesn't change the plans at all, Your Highness, said Vidin Mali. A stunned Daksha was sitting in his private office, having just received word of Kanakala's suicide. Your Highness, said Vidin Mali, when he didn't get a response. Yes, said Daksha, still reeling from shock, looking distracted. Listen to me, said Vidin Mali. We will go ahead with the plans as before. Swath's men are ready. Yes. Your Highness, said Vidin Mali loudly. Daksha's face suddenly showed some focus as he stared at Vidin Mali. Did you hear me, Your Highness? Asked Vidin Mali. Yes. Everyone will be told that Kanakala died in an accident. The peace conference will continue in her memory. Yes. Also, I have to go. What? Daksha seemed to panic. I told you, Your Highness, said Vidin Mali patiently, as if he was talking to a child. One of Kanakala's servants is missing. I fear he may have set out to warn the fraud Nilkanth. He has to be stopped. I'm going to ride out myself, towards the south, with a platoon. But how will I manage all this? You don't have to do anything. Everything is under control. My soldiers will find a way to bring Princess Sati into the palace. Nobody else from her party will be allowed to accompany her. The moment she is with you, signal my man who will wait at your window. He will shoot a fire arrow high in the air, which will signal to Swath's assassins that the coast is clear. They will then quickly move in and kill the fraud Nilkanth. They will also leave a few of Shiva's people alive so that they can testify that they were attacked by Nagas. Daksha still looked nervous. Vidin Mali stepped up and spoke gently. You don't have to worry. I have planned everything in detail. There will be no mistakes made. All you have to do is signal my man when Princess Sati enters your room. That's it. That's it? Yes, that's it. Now I really need to go, Your Highness. If Kanakala's man manages to reach the fraud Nilkanth, it will be the end of our plans. Of course. Go. Those sons of bitches. Scowled Kali. Jadavrana, the ruler of Umberjan, had just rowed up to the Naga fleet in a fast cutter. His small kingdom lay to the south of the Narmada. The Nagas had helped him on many occasions. And, Jadavrana was not an ungrateful man. When the fishermen in his kingdom informed him of a large Meluhan fleet stationed in a hidden lagoon nearby, he had gone personally to investigate. Keeping himself concealed, Jadav had seen the massive fleet and immediately surmised that this had something to do with the war raging in the north between the Nilkant's forces and the Meluhans. He had also received news that the Nagas themselves were racing down the western coast, towards the mouth of the Narmada. He'd immediately got into a fast cutter to intercept the Nagas before they entered the river that marked the southern boundary of the Sapt Sindhu. He was convinced the Meluhans intended to take the Nagas by surprise and attack them from the rear. Your Highness, said Jadavrana, I assumed the Meluhans would enter the Narmada after you and assault your rear guard. They could devastate your entire fleet before you even realized what had happened. I wouldn't be surprised if they have a forward ambush planned for us as well, said Kartik. We'll attack them in their hidden lagoon, said Kali. We'll burn their ships down and hang their rotten carcasses on the coastal trees. Ganesh had remained silent till now. Something was amiss. Your Highness, how many Meluhans are there? 50 ships, Lord Ganesh, said Jadavrana. It's a reasonably large force. But you have more than enough ships to take them on. I didn't ask you about the ships, Your Highness, said Ganesh. I asked how many men. Jadavrana frowned. I don't know, Lord Ganesh. He then turned to his men. Do you people have any idea? It's difficult to be sure, my lord, since they have largely remained on ship, said one of Jadavrana's lieutenants. But judging by the amount of food they have been foraging, I don't think there would be more than 5,000. You have many more men, Lord Ganesh. You can win very easily. Ganesh held his head. Bhumayadvi, be merciful. A stunned Kali stared at Jadavrana's lieutenant. Are you sure? Just 5,000? Jadavrana was surprised. He didn't understand why the Nagas looked so upset. Logically, they should have been happy. They outnumbered the Meluhans dramatically. My men are well acquainted with these coasts, Your Highness, said Jadavrana. If they're saying that the Meluhans number only 5,000, I would go with that number. We've been taken for a ride, said Ganesh. There's no attack planned on Panchavati. They were trying to divide our forces. And they succeeded. A worried Kartik looked at his elder brother. They are probably attacking Lothal even as we speak. And we took 100,000 men away from Ma, said a distraught Ganesh. Kali turned and yelled the order at her Prime Minister, Karkotak. Turn around, now. We're going back to Lothal. Double rowing till we get there. Move. Chapter 43. A Civil Revolt. Bharat and Brahaspati had come to the Lothal port, having been informed by an advance boat that Shiva's ship would be arriving soon. They could now see Shiva's merchant ship sailing in from the east, from the vantage position of the port walls. To the south, they could also see the naval contingent that had left under Kali's command. Steaming forward. All the ships would probably dock at Lothal at the same time. Brahaspati took a sharp intake of breath as he saw a woman on the forward deck of Shiva's ship. Bharat couldn't help notice the dramatic transformation in Brahaspati. He turned towards Shiva's ship. They were still quite far, but he could make out the countenance of Shiva and Gopal. Standing next to them was a woman, an Indian-looking woman. But the Indian prince didn't have the foggiest clue about her identity. Who is she, Brahaspati ji? Asked Bharat. Brahaspati was crying. O Lord Brahma! O Lord Brahma! Who is she? Brahaspati seemed to be delirious now. Delirious but happy. He turned around, rushing down the steps towards the docks. He was rambling in pure delight. They let her go. Shiva freed her. Lord Ram be praised, he freed her. Isn't that Shiva's ship? Said Kali, pointing ahead. Kali, Ganesh and Kartik had rushed back to Lothal and were surprised to discover that there was no siege on the city at all. They saw the merchant ship just ahead, pulling into the circular port. 15 minutes later Kali's ship docked at a berth as well. Shiva's ship was anchored just ahead of theirs. As soon as they got off the gangway plank, they rushed towards Shiva. They could see that Bharat and Brahaspati had come to receive the Nilkanth and Gopal. A stunned Brahaspati had just embraced a woman. Both of them were crying profusely. Shiva! Shouted Kali from a distance, sprinting towards him. Shiva turned and smiled at Kali. I saw the Naga ships behind us. Where had you gone? We were led on a wild goose chase, said Kali. We were led to believe that Panchavati was under attack. The Meluhan ships were a decoy? Asked Bharat. Yes, Prince Bharat, said Kartik. The ships had only 5,000 men. They had no intention of attacking Panchavati. That is good news, said Bharat. Where's Sati? Asked Shiva, looking around. There's some good news regarding her as well, said Bharat. Good news? Asked Ganesh. Yes, we may have found a solution to end the war, said Bharat. We've come back with a solution as well, said Gopal, pointing to the large trunk that was being lowered carefully onto the docks from their ship. Shiva looked again at an obviously delighted Brahaspati who was refusing to let go of Tara. She was crying inconsolably, her head gently nestled against Brahaspati's chest. They appeared like teenagers in the first heady flush of love. Looks like there is good news all around, said Shiva, smiling. How in the holy lake's name can this be good news? Bharat maintained a nervous silence, fearful of Shiva's wrath. But, my lord, said Chandrakatu, Lady Sati believed this was our best chance at peace. And it looks like Emperor Daksha himself wants it. If he signs a peace treaty, then the war is over. And we do not want to destroy Meluha, do we? All we want is the end of the Samras. I don't trust that goat of a man, said Kali. If he hurts my sister, I will burn his entire city to a cinder, with him in it. He won't hurt her, Kali, said Shiva, shaking his head. But I'm afraid that he may make her a prisoner and use that to negotiate with us. But, my lord, said Chinardwaj, that is impossible. The rules governing a peace conference are very clear. Both parties are free to return, unharmed, if a solution or compromise is not found. What's to stop my grandfather from not following the laws? Asked Ganesh. It will not be the first time he's broken a law. My lord, said a Vasudev Pandit entering the chamber and addressing Gopal. I have urgent news. I think we can talk later, Panditji, said Gopal. No, my lord, insisted the Pandit in charge of the Lothal temple. We must speak now. Gopal was surprised, but he knew his Vasudev Pandits did not panic unnecessarily. It had to be something important. He rose and walked up to the Pandit. Lord Ganesh, said Chinardwaj, resuming his conversation with Ganesh. The peace conference rules were laid down by Lord Ram himself. They are amongst the fundamental rules that can never be amended. They have to be rigorously followed, on pain of a punishment worse than death. Even a man like Emperor Daksha will never break these rules. I pray to the Paramatma that you are right, Chinardwaj, snarled Kali. I have no doubt, your highness, said Chinardwaj. The worst that can happen is that no deal will be struck. Then Lady Sati will return to us. Lord Ram, be merciful, exclaimed Gopal loudly. Everyone turned sharply to look at the chief Vasudev. Gopal was still standing close to the door, along with the Lothal Vasudev Pandit. "What happened, Panditji?" asked Shiva. An ashen-faced Gopal turned to Shiva. "Great Nilkanth, the news is disturbing." "What is it?" "Parvateshwar's army finally mobilized and marched out of Gurukapa 3 days back." A loud murmur erupted in the chamber. They would have to prepare for battle. "Silence," snapped Shiva, before turning to Gopal. "And?" "Surprisingly, they turned back within a few hours," said Gopal. "Turned back? Why?" "I don't know," said Gopal. "My Vasudev Pandit tells me the army has been sent back to the barracks. But Lord Parvateshwar and Lord Brigu have pressed on. They set sail up the Indus in a lone fast ship, with just their personal bodyguards." "Where are they going?" asked an alarmed Shiva. "I have been told that they're rushing towards Devagiri." Shiva felt a chill run up his spine. "And a flurry of birds have been flying out of Gurukapa," said Gopal. "All of them towards Devagiri. My Pandit at Gurukapa doesn't know the contents of those messages. But he says he has never seen so much communication between Gurukapa and Devagiri." There was deathly silence in the chamber. All those present were aware of Parvateshwar's spotless reputation for honorable conduct. If he was rushing to Devagiri without a large army that would slow him down, it only meant that something terrible was going on in the Meluhan capital. And he was rushing to stop it. Shiva was the first to recover. "Get the army mobilized immediately. We're marching out." "Yes, my lord," said Bhagat, rising quickly. "And, Bhagat, I want to leave within hours, not days," said Shiva. "Yes, my lord," said Bhagat, hurrying out. Chandrakatu, Chinardhwaj, Mintli, Ganesh and Kartik hastily followed the Indian prince. "Ma will be all right, Baba," said Kartik, allowing hope to triumph over confidence. Shiva and his entourage had stopped for a quick meal, just a few hours outside of Lothal. The Nilkanths had marched out immediately with Kartik, Ganesh, Kali, Gopal, Virabhadra, Parshuram, Yervati and an entire brigade. Their main army, led by Bhagat, would move out the next morning. Shiva's entire being was racked with worry. He couldn't wait till the entire army was mobilized. He had taken the Pashupashastra with him, as insurance. "Kartik is right, great Nilkanth," said Gopal. "It's possible that Emperor Dakshal may break the rules of a peace conference, but he will not hurt Princess Sati. He may try to imprison her to improve his negotiating position. But we have the Pashupashastra. That changes everything." Shiva nodded silently. Kali listened intently to Gopal. But the words did not give her any solace. She did not trust her father. She was deeply troubled about the safety of her sister. She was consumed with guilt about the petulant way in which she had parted with Sati. The two extra arms on her shoulders were in a constant quiver. Shiva held Kali's hand and smiled faintly. "Relax, Kali. Nothing will happen to her. The Paramatma will not allow such an injustice." Kali was too pained to respond. "Finish your food," said Shiva. "We have to leave in the next few minutes." As Kali began gulping down her food, Shiva turned towards Ganesh. The Nilkanth's elder son was staring into the forest, his eyes moist. Ganesh had not touched the food. In front of him, Shiva could see he was praying under his breath, his hands clasped tightly, repeating a chant in rapid succession. "Ganesh," said Shiva. "Eat." Ganesh was pulled back from his trance. "I'm not hungry, Baba." "Ganesh," said Shiva firmly. "We may have to engage in battle at the moment we reach Devagiri. I will require all of you to be strong. And for that you need to eat. So if you love your mother and want to protect her, keep yourself strong. Eat." Ganesh nodded and looked at his banana leaf plate. He had to eat. Shiva turned towards Vibhadra, who had already finished and was wiping his hands on a piece of cloth that Kritika had handed to him. Bhadra, order the heralds to make an announcement, said Shiva. We'll leave in 10 minutes. Yes, Shiva, said Vibhadra and rose up immediately. Shiva pushed his empty banana leaf plate aside and walked away. He reached the wooden drum where the water was stored, scooped some water out with his hands and gargled. A chill ran up his spine again. He looked up at the sky, towards the north, about to make a prayer to the holy lake. Then he shook his head. It wasn't required. He'll not hurt her. He cannot hurt her. If there's one person in this world that fool loves, it is my Sati. He'll not hurt her. You are behaving like traitors, shouted Vraka. Brigadier Vraka had been ordered by Parvateshwar to mobilize the army quickly and leave for Devagiri. Parvateshwar hadn't told them anything about why they were required in the Meluhan capital, and the general himself had rushed out earlier with Maharishi Brigu. It had taken Vraka 2 days to get his soldiers boarded onto ships and begin their journey up the Indus. However, they had been waylaid at Mohenjo-daro by a non-violent protest. The governor of the city remained loyal to the emperor, but his people worshipped the Nilkanth. When they heard that their army was sailing up the Indus to battle with the Nilkanth, they decided to rebel. Almost the entire population of Mohenjo-daro had marched out of the city, boarded their boats and anchored all across the river. The line of boats extended across the massive breadth of the Indus and covered nearly a kilometer in length. It was impossible for Vraka to ram his ships through such an effective blockade. We will be traitors to Emperor Daksha, said the leader of the protesters, but we will not be traitors to the Nilkanth. Vraka drew his sword. I will kill you all if you don't move, he warned. Go ahead. Kill us all. We will not raise our hands. We will not fight against our own army. But I swear by the great Lord Ram, we will not move. Vraka snorted in anger. By not fighting with him, the citizens were not giving him a legal reason to attack them. He had been stymied. Slowly regaining consciousness, Vidyanmali saw that he was lying on a cart that was ambling along on the riverside road. He raised his head. The fresh stitches on his stomach hurt. Lie back down, my lord, said the soldier. You need to rest. Is that traitor dead? Asked Vidyanmali. Yes, said the soldier. Vidyanmali and his platoon had raced down the riverside road leading from Devagiri to Lothal. They had managed to waylay Kanakala's servant, who was rushing to Lothal to warn Shiva of the planned perfidy at Devagiri. The servant had been killed, but not before he had managed to stab Vidyanmali viciously in his stomach. How far are we from Devagiri? Asked Vidyanmali. At the pace we're going, another 5 days, my lord. That's too long. You cannot ride a horse, my lord. The stitches may burst open. You have to travel by bullock cart. Vidyanmali cursed under his breath. Chapter 44. A Princess Returns. Sati and her entourage surveyed the scene from the docked ship in Devagiri. They had commandeered a fast merchant ship and sailed up the Saraswati speedily to reach in time for the peace conference. Nandi stood beside Sati and gestured at the sky. Look, he said, pointing to a small bird winging its way overhead. Another homing pigeon. It was not the first that they had spotted. Sati's warriors had seen more than a few pigeons flying in the direction of Devagiri. Lord Ganesh believes that eavesdropping can give us good intelligence on the enemy's plan, said Nandi. Shall we shoot one of them and see what is being discussed? Sati shook her head. We will obey the laws Lord Ram set for us, Nandi, and negotiate in good faith. Lord Ram said that there is no such thing as a small wrong. Understanding your opponent's strategy prior to peace negotiations, through the use of subterfuge, will give us only a small advantage. But to behave without honor is against Lord Ram's way. Nandi bowed his head in Sati's direction. I'm Lord Ram's servant, princess. Sati turned away, and Nandi glanced one last time at the tiny speck of a bird, disappearing into Devagiri. The docks of the port had been completely cleared out, with no sign of commerce or any other activity. From the vantage point of her ship deck, Sati could see the walls of Devagiri in the distance. She remembered that there were those who lovingly called the city Tripura, in honor of its 3 platforms named after gold, silver, and bronze. But the name had never really caught on. The citizens of Devagiri couldn't imagine tampering with the name that Lord Ram himself had given it. With a loud thud, the gangway plank was lowered onto the dock. Sati signaled to Nandi and whispered, "Let's go." As she began leading her men out, a Meluhan protocol officer walked up to her, a broad smile plastered on his face. The Meluhan noticed Sati's disfigured left cheek, but wisely refrained from commenting on it. "My lady, it's an honor to meet you once again. It's a pleasure to be back in my city, Major. And in better circumstances this time." The Meluhan acknowledged the reference with a solemn nod. "I hope you will succeed in negotiating a lasting peace, my lady," said the Meluhan. "You can't imagine how distressed we Meluhans are that our country is at war with our living God. With Lord Ram's blessing, the war will end. And we shall have lasting peace." The Meluhan joined his hands together and looked up at the sky. "With Lord Ram's blessing." Sati stepped out of the port area to find a large circular building that had been quickly constructed for the proceedings of the peace conference. One of the rules laid down for a peace conference was that it couldn't take place within the host city itself. The current venue was in a healthy distance from the city walls, almost adjacent to the port. The peace conference building had been constructed on a large rectangular base of standard Meluhan bricks, almost a meter high. Tall wooden columns had been hammered into holes on top of the space. The columns served as the skeleton for the structure. Smaller bamboo sticks had been tied together and stretched across these poles, creating an enclosed circular wooden building that was surprisingly strong, despite no mortar having been used in its construction. Sati looked up at the high ceiling as soon as she entered the structure and spoke loudly to check the acoustics. "Good construction." The sound did not reverberate. Sati smiled. Meluhan engineers had not lost their talent. A large idol of Lord Ram and Lady Sita had been placed near the entrance of this cavernous chamber. From the flowers and other oblations scattered around the idols, Sati knew that the chief priest of Devagiri had conducted the Pran Pratishta ceremony. The life force of the 2 deities had been infused into the idols. A true Hindu would, therefore, believe that Lord Ram and Lady Sita themselves were residing in the idols and were supervising the proceedings. Nobody would dare to break the law in their presence. A separate enclosures had been walled off at one end. There was a large wooden door in the middle. The room within had been completely soundproofed so that even the most raucous sounds would not be able to travel beyond its walls. It had been set aside for private internal discussions for either party during the course of the conference. Sati nodded. "The arrangements are precisely in keeping with the ancient laws." "Thank you, my lady," said the Meluhan. "Now the armory," said Sati. "Of course, my lady," said the Meluhan. "We can leave right away." As she stepped out of the conference hall, she saw her horse tethered outside. It had been unloaded from her ship and was saddled up and ready. The horses of her companions had been similarly saddled, girthed and groomed. "My lady," said the Meluhan, "you do know that according to the laws, the animals will also need to be locked up next to the armory. All your horses will be taken away. All except mine, said Sati. Very few are more well versed with the laws of Lord Ram than her. The leader of the visitors was allowed to keep his or her horse. My horse remains with me. Of course, my lady. And the horses of my men will be returned as soon as the conference is over. That is the law, my lady. And the animals with Indivagiri would also be locked up. Of course, my lady, said the Meluhan. That has already been done. All right, said Sati. Let's go. The temporary armory had been built outside the city walls under the connecting bridge between the Svarna and Tamri platforms, once again, to exact specifications. A massive door with a double lock had been built at the entryway, making it almost impossible to break into. One of the keys was handed over to Sati, who personally checked that the door was locked. The Meluhan protocol officer used his key to double lock the door, allowed Sati to check it again, and then fixed a seal on top of the lock. All the weapons in Divagiri had been effectively put out of reach. Sati handed over her key to Nandi. Keep this carefully. Bowing and turning to leave, the officer hesitated, as if remembering something. My lady, your weapons? Aren't they supposed to be locked in here as well? No, said Sati. My lady, but the rules state that. What the rules say, Major, interrupted Sati, is that the armies have to be disarmed. But the personal bodyguards and the leaders at the peace conference are allowed to retain their weapons. I'm sure my father's bodyguards have not been disarmed, have they? No, my lady, replied the Meluhan protocol officer, they still hold their weapons. As will my bodyguards, said Sati, pointing to Nandi and her other soldiers. But, my lady, why don't you check with Prime Minister Kanakula? I'm sure she will know the law. The Meluhan protocol officer didn't say anything further. He knew that Sati was legally correct. He also knew that Prime Minister Kanakula could not be called upon for any clarifications. Meanwhile, Sati was looking at the giant animal enclosure a few hundred meters away. The horses of her men were being led in there for a temporary sequester. Also, my lady, said the protocol officer, Emperor Daksha has made a request for your presence at his palace for lunch. Sati turned towards Nandi. I'll ride ahead. You check the lock on the animal enclosures. And then join me in. My lady, said the officer, interrupting Sati. The instructions were very clear. He wanted you to come alone. Sati frowned. This was unorthodox. She was about to reject the suggestion when the officer spoke up again. My lady, I don't think this has anything to do with the conference. You are His Highness' daughter. A father has the right to expect that he can have a meal with his daughter. Sati took a deep breath. She was in no mood to break bread with her father. But she would dearly like to meet her mother. In any case, the conference was scheduled for the following day. There was nothing much to do today. Nandi, once you have checked the enclosure, go back to the conference building and wait for me. I'll be back soon. As you command, my lady, said Nandi. But may I have a word with you before you leave? Of course, said Sati. In private, my lady, said Nandi. Sati frowned, but left the reins of her horse in the hands of a soldier standing discreetly at the back, and then walked aside. When they were out of earshot, Nandi whispered, if I may be so bold as to make a suggestion, my lady, please don't think you are going to meet your father. Think instead that you are going to meet the emperor with whom you will be negotiating. Please use this lunch as an opportunity to set the right atmosphere for the peace conference tomorrow. Sati smiled. You are right, Nandi. Sati tied her horse at the stables near the palace steps, refusing the proffered assistance of the attendant. Owing to the peace conference, there were no animals in Divagiri, so Sati's was the only horse present. As she approached the main steps of her father's palace, The guards in attendance executed a smart military salute. Sati saluted back politely and continued walking. She had grown up in this palace, sauntered around its attached gardens, run up and down the steps a million times, practiced the fine art of swordsmanship on its grounds. Yet, the building felt alien to her now. Maybe it was because she had been away for so many years. Or more likely, it was because she didn't feel any kinship with her father anymore. She knew her way around the palace and did not need the aid of the various soldiers who kept emerging to guide her onward. She was surprised though that she couldn't recognize any of them. Perhaps Vidin had changed the troops after taking over her father's security. She waved the soldiers away repeatedly, walking unerringly towards her father's chamber. "Her Highness, Princess Sati," announced the chief doorman loudly as one of his lieutenants opened the door to the royal chamber. Sati walked in to find Daksha, Virini and a man she didn't recognize, who stood at the far end of the chamber. Judging by his armband, he was a colonel in the Meluhan army. As she turned towards her parents, the Meluhan colonel looked out of the window and imperceptibly nodded at someone standing outside. "By the great Lord Ram, what happened to your face?" exclaimed Daksha. Sati folded her hands together into a namaste and bowed low, showing respect, as she must, to her father. "It's nothing, father. Just a mark of war. A warrior bears her scars with pride," said the Meluhan colonel congenially, his hands held together in a respectful namaste. Sati looked at the Meluhan quizzically as she returned his namaste. "I'm afraid I don't know you, colonel." "I've been newly assigned, my lady," said the Meluhan colonel. "I have served as second in command to Brigadier Vidin. My name is Kamalaksh." Sati had never really liked Vidin, but that was no reason to dislike Kamalaksh. She nodded politely at the Meluhan colonel, before turning to her mother with a warm smile. "How are you, ma'am?" Sati had never addressed Virini by the more affectionate name. She'd always used the formal term mother. But Virini liked this change. She walked up and embraced her daughter. "My child." Sati held her mother tight. Years spent with Shiva had broken the mold. She could now freely express her pent-up feelings. "I've missed you, my child," whispered Virini. "I've missed you too, ma," said Sati, her eyes moist. Virini touched Sati's scar and bit her lip. "It's all right," said Sati, with a slight smile. "It doesn't hurt." "Why don't you get your Vati to remove it?" asked Virini. "I will, ma," said Sati. "But the beauty of my face is not important. What is important is to find a way towards peace." "I hope Lord Ram helps your father and the Nilkanth to do so," said Virini. Daksha smiled broadly. "I have already found a way, Sati. And we'll all be together once again, a happy family, like before. By the way, I hope the Nilkanth didn't mind waiting in the camp outside. After all, it would not be considered a good omen for us to meet before the peace conference." Sati frowned at her father's strange suggestion that all of them would be living together as a family once again. She was about to clarify that Shiva had not come with her to Devagiri, but Daksha turned to Kamalaksh. "Order the attendants to bring in lunch. I'm famished. As I'm sure are the women in my family," said Daksha. "Of course, my lord." Virini was still holding Sati's hand. "It is sad that your Vati wasn't here last week." "Why?" asked Sati. "Had she been here, she would certainly have saved Kanakala. Nobody has the medical skills that she possesses." From the corner of her eye, Sati could see Daksha's body stiffen. "Virini, you talk too much. We need to eat and—" "One moment, father," said Sati, turning back to her mother. "What happened to Kanakala? Didn't you know?" asked a surprised Virini. "She died suddenly. I believe there was Some kind of accident in her house. Accident? Asked a suspicious Sati, whirling around to face Daksha. What happened to her father? It was an accident, Sati, said Daksha. You don't need to make a mountain of every molehill. On seeing Daksha's evasive reaction to Sati's question, Virini got suspicious as well. What's going on, Daksha? Will you two please give it a rest? We've come together for a meal after a very long time. So let us just enjoy this moment. Everything will be fine soon, princess, said Kamalaksh, in a soft voice. Sati did not turn her attention to Kamalaksh. But there was something creepy in his voice. Her instincts kicked in. Father, what are you hiding? Oh, for Lord Ram's sake, said Daksha. If you are so worried about your husband, I'll have some special food sent out for him as well. I did not mention Shiva, said Sati. You are avoiding my question. What happened to Kanakula? Daksha cursed in frustration, slamming his fist on a desk. Will you trust your father for once? My blood runs in your veins. Would I ever do anything that is not in your interest? If I say Kanakula died in an accident, then that is what happened. Sati stared into her father's eyes. You're lying. Kanakula got what she deserved, princess, said Kamalaksh, from directly behind her. As will everyone who dares to oppose the true lord of Meluha. But you don't need to worry. You are safe because your father adores you. A stunned Sati glanced back briefly towards Kamalaksh and then turned to her father. Daksha's eyes were moist as he spoke with a wry smile. If only you'd understand how much I love you, my child. Just trust me. I will make everything all right once again. Almost imperceptibly, Sati tensed her muscular frame and shot her right elbow back into Kamalaksh's solar plexus. The surprised colonel staggered back as he bent over with pain, thus bringing his head within her range. Losing no time, Sati sprung onto her left foot and swung her right leg in a great arc, a lethal strike that she had learned from the Nagas. Her right heel crashed with brutal force into Kamalaksh's head, right between his ear and temple. It burst his eardrum and rendered him unconscious. The giant frame of the colonel came crashing down onto the floor. Sati swung full circle in the same smooth motion and faced Daksha again. Quick as lightning, she drew her sword and pointed it at her father. It all happened so quickly that Daksha had no time to react. What have you done, father? Screamed Sati, her anger at boiling point. It's for your own good, shrieked Daksha. Your husband will not trouble us anymore. Sati finally understood. Lord Ram, be merciful. Nandi and my soldiers. My God! Cried Virini, moving towards him. What have you done, Daksha? Shut up, Virini! Screamed Daksha, as he shoved her aside and rushed towards Sati. Virini was in shock. How could you break the laws of a peace conference? You have damned your soul forever. You can't go out! Shouted Daksha, trying to get a hold of Sati. Sati pushed Daksha hard, causing the emperor to fall on the floor. She turned and ran towards the door, her sword held tight in her hand, ready for battle. Stop her! Yelled Daksha. Guards! Stop her! The doorman opened the door, stunned to see the princess sprinting towards him. The guards at the door were immobilized by shock. Stop her! Bellowed Daksha. Before the guards could react, Sati crashed into them, pushed them aside and burst through the door. She raced down the main corridor. She could still hear her father screaming repeatedly for his guards to stop her. She had to get to her horse. No one else was in possession of one Indivagiri at this time. Were she able to do so, she could easily speed past all the guards and ride out of the city. Stop the princess! Screamed a guard from behind. Sati saw a platoon of guards taking position up ahead. They held their spears out, blocking the way. She looked behind her without slowing down. Another platoon of soldiers was running towards her from the other end. She was trapped. Lord Ram, give me strength. Sati heard Dakshaw's distant voice. Don't hurt her. A window to the left was open, up ahead. She was on the third floor. It would be foolish to jump. But she knew this palace well, it had been home. She knew that there was a thin ledge above the window. A short jump from there would land her on the palace terrace. Thereafter, she could race away from a side entrance towards the palace gate. Before anyone would be able to reach her. Sati sheathed her sword and raised her hands, as if in surrender. The soldiers thought they had her and moved forward, slowing their gait so as to calm the princess' nerves. Sati suddenly jumped to her side, and was out of the window in a flash. The soldiers gasped, thinking the princess had fallen to a certain death into the courtyard below. But Sati had stretched her hands out simultaneously and used the momentum to jump up, grab the edge of the protruding ledge, swing upwards, and then land safely on top of the ledge in a half flip. She took a moment to balance herself. She then took a couple of quick steps and leapt onto the terrace. She's on the terrace! Screamed a soldier. Sati knew the path the soldiers would take. She quickly ran the other way, towards the far end of the terrace, jumping onto another ledge. She crept along the ledge till she reached another terrace, leapt onto it and sprinted towards the staircase on the far side. She charged down the stairs, 3 steps at a time, till she reached the landing above the first floor, which led to a side entrance. While this entrance was usually not guarded, she didn't want to take a chance. She leapt out of the balcony into the small garden at the side. There was a tree right next to the wall. She clambered onto the tree, reached its highest branch and used the elevation to jump over the boundary wall. She landed right next to her horse. In one leap, she mounted her horse, freed its reins and kicked the animal into motion. "There she is!" shouted a guard. 20 guards rushed towards Sati, but she pushed through, refusing to slow down. Her horse galloped out of the palace enclosure and within seconds she was out into the city. She could hear the distant shouts of the guards screaming and swearing behind her. "Stop her! Stop the princess!" Startled Maluhans scrambled out of the way to escape the flaying hooves of Sati's steed. She turned into a small lane to avoid a big crowd of citizens up ahead, and came out of a different access road which led straight to the city's main gates. She rode hard, pushing her horse to its limit, and was through the iron gates in no time. As soon as she crossed to the other side, her horse reared ferociously onto its hind legs, disturbed by loud noises of battle in the distance. From the vantage point of the Devagiri city platform, Sati had a clear view of the venue of the peace conference, right next to the Saraswati, nearly 4 kilometers away. Her people were under attack. A large number of cloaked and hooded men were battling Nandi and his vastly outnumbered soldiers, many of whom already lay on the ground. Hiya! Sati kicked her horse hard, goading it into a swift gallop. She raced down the central steps of the Svarna platform of Devagiri, straight towards the battling men, screaming the war cry of those loyal to the Nilkanth. Har Har Mahadev. Chapter 45. The Final Kill. As she sped towards the battleground, Sati could estimate that there were almost 300 cloaked assassins. They wore masks, just like the Nagas. But their battle style was nothing like the warriors from Panchavati. They were obviously some other group, being made to look like the Nagas. Nearly half of Sati's 100 bodyguards were already on the ground, either grievously injured or dead. Since the assassins and her soldiers were completely locked in combat, there was no clear line of enemies whom she could ride her horse into and mow down. She knew she'd have to dismount and fight. As she neared the battle scene, she rode towards the area where Nandi was combating 3 assassins simultaneously. She heard Nandi's loud scream as he brutally drove his sword into his enemy's heart. He turned to his left, easily lifted the diminutive assassin impaled on his sword, and flung the hapless soul's body onto an oncoming attacker. Another assassin had moved up to Nandi, ready to slash him from behind. Sati pulled her feet out of the stirrups, jumped up and leveraged herself to crouch on top of her saddle, even as she drew her sword out. As she neared the assassin who was about to slash Nandi from the rear, she flung herself from her horse and swung her sword viciously at the same time, decapitating the assassin in one fell swoop. Sati landed on her side and smoothly rolled over to stand behind Nandi as the quivering body of the beheaded assassin collapsed to the ground, blood bursting through his adrenalized heart, pumping the life-giving fluid furiously out of his gaping neck. "My lady!" yelled Nandi over the din, slashing hard at another assassin in front. "Run!" Sati stood steadfast, defensively back to back with Nandi, covering all angles. "Not without all of you!" An assassin leapt at Sati from the side, as she pulled her shield forward. He reached into the folds of his robe and threw something at her eyes. Instinctively, she pulled her shield up. A black egg splattered against her shield, deflecting its contents, shards of metal, safely away from her eyes. Some of the shrapnel cut through her left arm. Sati had heard of this combat maneuver. It was Egyptian. Eggs were drained of their contents through a small hole and then filled with bits and pieces of sharp metal. These were flung at the eyes of enemies, thus blinding them. Usually the next move was a low sword thrust. Though her vision was blocked by her shield, Sati moved instinctively and swerved to her side, to avoid the expected low blow. Then she pressed a lever on her shield, extending a short blade which she rammed into her opponent's neck, ferociously driving the blade through his windpipe. As the assassin began to choke on his own blood, Sati ran her sword through his heart. Nandi, meanwhile, was effortlessly killing all those in front of him. He was a big man, and he towered over the diminutive Egyptians like a giant. Not one of the assassins could even come close as he hacked through anyone who dared to challenge him. They threw knives and the modified eggs at him, but nothing got through to any vital part of his body. With a knife buried in his shoulder and numerous metallic shrapnel pierced all over his body, a bloodied Nandi fought relentlessly against his enemies. But both Nandi and Sati could see that the odds were stacked heavily against them. Most of their soldiers were falling, overwhelmed by the surprise attack and the sheer numbers. Escape isn't an option either, as they were now surrounded on all sides. Their only hope was that other Suryavanshis and Devagiri, who were not part of Dakshaw's conspiracy, would come to their aid. An assassin swung at Sati from a high angle on the right. She swung back with vicious force, blocking his blow. The man turned and swerved from the left this time, hoping to push Sati on her back foot. Sati met his strike with equal ferocity. The assassin then attempted to drop low and stab Sati through her abdomen, but he was unaware of her special technique. Most warriors can only swing their sword in the natural direction, away from their body. Very few can swing it towards their own body, because of a lack of strength and skill. Sati could. Hence, both the inner and the outer sides of her sword were sharpened. Unlike the vast majority of swords which only have sharpened outer edges, Sati swung back, and with a near impossible stroke, masterfully pulled her sword arm towards herself with tremendous force. The surprised assassin had his throat cut cleanly before he could respond. The wound was deep, almost beheading the man. The Egyptian's head fell backwards, dangling tenuously from his body by a shred of tissue, his eyes still rolling in his head. Sati kicked his body away as it collapsed. She saw movement on her left and realized her mistake too late. She tried to block the sword stroke from the second assassin, but it glanced off her sword, and went up into her scarred left cheek, cutting through her eye and grating off her skull. Her left eye collapsed in its socket, and blood poured from the wound, obscuring the vision in her other eye. Blinded, she executed a desperate defensive block, hoping to ward off any blows while she tried to wipe the blood from her face. She heard a woman panting, almost sobbing, and realized that it was she herself. She braced as the man moved forward for a second attack. She detected a movement from the right, and through her pinkish blurred vision, she saw Nandi swing from his massive height, beheading the assassin in one fell swoop. "My lady!" screamed Nandi, pulling his shield forward to protect himself from another assassin's blow. "Run!" The world had slowed around her, and his voice came to her as if from a great distance. She could hear her own heart beating, hear her breath gasping as she gazed at the carnage. The bodies of her guards lay bloodied and broken at her feet. Some of the fallen still lived, reaching and clawing at the legs of the attackers in desperation, until they were kicked aside in annoyance, their lives finished with half-distracted sword strokes of irritation. "My arrogance," a voice whispered in her head. "I have failed them. Again." Her brain had blocked out the throbbing in her mutilated eye. She spat out the blood, streaking down her face and into her mouth. Using her good right eye, she swung back into battle. Stepping back to avoid a brutal stab from another assassin, she slashed her sword from the right and sliced through his hand. As the Egyptian howled in pain, Sati rammed her shield into his head, cracking open his skull. She stabbed the staggering assassin in his eye, pulled her sword back quickly and turned to face another. The assassin flung a knife across the distance. It cut through Sati's upper left arm, getting stuck in her biceps, restricting the movement of her defensive limb. Sati snarled in fury and swung her sword viciously across the assassin's body, cutting through the cloak and slashing deep into his chest. As the man staggered back, Sati delivered the killer blow, a stab straight through his heart. But the flow of assassins was unrelenting. Another one ran into battle. Sati, using sheer will to overpower her tiring body, Sati raised her blood-drenched sword once again. Swath was observing the battle from a short distance away. His orders had been to ensure the death of the one they called Neelkanth. Surely he was the tall one, the powerful warrior, cutting down all his opponents with such ease. Swath moved into the fray, striding towards the embattled Nandi. Nandi looked up and turned to face his new opponent, swinging his sword fiercely at Swath's blade. The Egyptian stepped back, his hand stinging with the force of Nandi's blow. Swath dropped his sword and drew out two curved blades, something he kept for special occasions. Nandi had never seen swords such as these. They were short, a little less than 2/3 the length of his own sword. They curved in sharply at their edges, almost like hooks. The hilts of the swords were also peculiar, since most of it was made of uncovered metal, instead of being enveloped in leather or wood. A sword fighter would have to be very skilled not to cut himself while holding such swords, for the handles were also unsheathed sharp metal. Swath was no amateur. He swung both swords in a circular motion skillfully and fought with frightening speed. Nandi, never having seen swords and a battle style such as this, was naturally cautious and kept his shield held high. He waited for the Egyptian to move in, while keeping a safe distance at the same time. Using the attention that Nandi had focused on Swath, and Sati's distraction with battling the assassin on her side, an Egyptian moved in suddenly and slashed Nandi's back viciously with his sword. Nandi roared with fury as his body lurched forward in reaction to the excruciatingly painful wound. Swath used this moment to suddenly hook his left sword onto his right blade, thus extending its reach twofold, and swung hard from a low angle, aiming a little below Nandi's defensive shield. The sharp edge on the metallic hilt sliced through Nandi's left arm, severing it cleanly, a few inches above his wrist. The Suryavanshi bellowed in pain. As blood burst from his slashed limb, the shock of the massive blow causing his heart to pump furiously. Swath stabbed close to a paralyzed Nandi and slashed at his right arm, hacking the sword-bearing limb just below the elbow. The mighty Suryavanshi, with blood bursting forth from both his severed limbs, collapsed on the ground. Swath spat as he kicked both of Nandi's hacked hands away. "Damn!" cursed Swath as he wiped some of his spittle that had got stuck on the Naga mask that he wasn't used to wearing. But he was careful enough to curse in Sanskrit. He had strictly forbidden his people from speaking in their native Egyptian tongue. The charade of their being Nagas had to be strictly maintained. "Nandi!" screamed Sati, as she swirled around and thrust her sword at Swath. Swath moved aside, easily avoiding her attack. Another assassin swung his sword from behind Sati, cutting through her upper back and left shoulder. "Wait!" said Swath, as two of his men were about to plunge their swords into her heart. The assassins immediately held Sati's arms, awaiting Swath's instructions. The leader did not want to sully his tongue by speaking to a woman, a sex that he believed was far beneath men, only a little better than animals. "Ask her who the blue-throated lord is." One of his assistants looked at Sati and repeated Swath's question. A shocked Sati did not hear them. She continued to stare at Nandi, lying prone on the ground, losing blood at an alarming rate from his severed limbs. But the unconscious Suryavanshi was still breathing. She knew that since the wounds were only on the limbs, the blood loss would not be so severe as to cause immediate death. If she managed to keep him alive for some more time, expert medical help could still save him. "Is this the blue-throated lord?" asked Swath, pointing at Nandi. Swath's assistant repeated his question to Sati. But Sati was looking towards the gates of Devagiri from the corner of her eye. She could see people at the top of the platform running towards her. They would probably reach in another 10 to 15 minutes. She had to keep Nandi alive for that much time. Swath shook his head when he did not get any response from Sati. A curse of Atanan. These stupid baby-producing machines. Sati stared at Swath, catching on to his mistake and swearing in his own god's name. Sure at last of his identity. He was an Egyptian, an assassin of the cult of Aten. She had learned about their culture in her youth. She knew immediately what she had to do. Swath pointed at Nandi and turned to his men. "Behead this fat giant. He must be the blue-throated lord. Leave the other injured alive. They will bear witness that they were attacked by the Nagas. And collect our dead. We'll leave immediately." "He's not the blue-throated one," spat Sati. "Can't you see his neck, you Egyptian idiot?" The Egyptian holding Sati hit her hard across her face. Swath sniggered. "Leave the giant alive," said Swath, before turning to one of his fighters. "Qaya, torture this hag before you kill her." "With pleasure, my lord," smiled Qaya, who was not the best of assassins, but an expert in the fine art of torture. Swath turned to his other men. "How many times do I have to repeat myself, you putrid remains of a camel's dung? Start gathering our dead. We leave in a few moments." As Swath's assassins started implementing his order, Qaya moved towards Sati, returning his blood-streaked sword to its scabbard. He then pulled out a knife. A smaller blade always made torture much easier. Sati suddenly straightened up and shouted loudly, "The duel of Aten!" Qaya stopped in his tracks, stunned. Swath stared at Sati, surprised beyond measure. The duel of Aten was an ancient code of the Egyptian assassins, wherein anyone could challenge them to a duel. They were honor-bound to engage in the duel. It could only be a one-on-one fight. Multiple assassins could not attack or they would suffer the wrath of their fiery sun god, an everlasting curse from Aten. Qaya turned towards Swath, unsure. Swath stared at Kuya. You know the law. Kuya nodded, throwing his knife away. He drew his sword, pulled his shield forward, and waited. Sati wrenched herself free from the assassins who were holding her. She bent down and ripped out some cloth from a fallen assassin's cloak, tying the strip of cloth across her face, covering her mutilated eye in an effort to stem the blood from flowing across her face. She hoped this would give her unimpeded vision and not disturb the good eye. Then she slowly pulled out the knife buried in her upper arm and tied another strip of cloth around the injury, using her teeth to tighten the bind. She then drew her sword and held her shield high. Ready. Waiting. Kuya suddenly threw his shield away. All the assassins standing around burst out laughing and began to clap. Clearly, Kuya was taunting Sati, suggesting that he didn't even need his shield to combat a stupid woman. Much to Kuya's surprise, Sati threw her shield away as well. Kuya bellowed loudly and charged, swinging his sword at a high angle. Sati smoothly leaned back and swerved to the left as she avoided the strike. Kuya turned swiftly and swung his sword high again, catching Sati by surprise. The Egyptian's sword cut through Sati's left hand, slicing off 4 fingers. Much to his surprise, Sati didn't flinch from the injury but swung her sword from a height at Kuya. Kuya swerved and defended Sati's blow with an elevated strike. Sati, meanwhile, had surmised that the swinging strike was Kuya's standard attack. She played to that as she kept swinging at Kuya from a high angle and the Egyptian kept striking back. Both of them kept changing the direction repeatedly to surprise the other. But the strikes were almost typical and therefore, no serious injury was caused. Suddenly, Sati dropped to one knee and swung hard. The strike hit home. Her blade hacked brutally through Kuya's abdomen, cutting deep. He collapsed as his intestines spilled onto the ground. Sati stood up, towering over a kneeling Kuya, who had been paralyzed by the intense pain. She held her sword high vertically, and thrust it through Kuya's neck, straight down, deep into his body right up to his heart, killing him instantly. Swath stared at Sati, dumbfounded. It wasn't just her skill with the sword that had surprised him, it was also her character. She hadn't beheaded Kuya when she could easily have done so. She let him keep his head. She gave him an honorable death, a soldier's death. She had followed the rules of the duel of Aden, even though the rules were not her own. Sati pulled aside and ran her bloodied sword into the soft muddy ground. She bent over and ripped another piece of cloth from the now dead Kuya's cloak and tied it around her left palm, covering the area where her fingers had been amputated. She stood tall, pulled up her sword from the ground and held it aloft, careful not to look at Nandi. Just a few more minutes. Who's next? Another assassin stepped forward, reached for his sword and then hesitated. He had seen Sati battle brilliantly with the long blade. He drew out a knife from his shoulder belt. Instead, I don't have a knife, said Sati, putting her sword back in its scabbard, wanting to fight fair. Swath pulled out his knife and flung it high in Sati's direction. She reached out and caught the beautifully balanced weapon easily. In the meantime, the assassin had removed his mask and pulled back his hood. He didn't want to suffer the disadvantage of a restricted vision against a skilled warrior. Having lost 4 fingers of her left hand, Sati couldn't battle this assassin the way she had battled Tarak in Kurukapa many years ago, where she had hidden the knife behind her back with the aim of confusing her opponent about the direction of attack. So, she held the knife in front, in her right hand. But she kept the hilt forward with the blade pointing back, towards herself, much to the surprise of the gathered assassins. The Egyptian adopted the traditional fighting stance, and pointed the knife directly at Sati. He moved forward and slashed hard. Sati jumped back to avoid the blow, but the Blade sliced her shoulder, drawing some blood. This emboldened the assassin to move in further, swinging the knife left and then right as he charged in. Sati kept stepping back, allowing the assassin to draw closer into the trap. The assassin suddenly changed tack and thrust forward with a jabbing motion. Sati swerved right to avoid the blow, raising her right hand. She now held the knife high above her left shoulder. But she hadn't moved back far enough. The assassin's knife sliced through the left side of her abdomen, lodging deep within her, right up to the hilt. Without flinching at the horrifying pain, Sati brought her hand down hard from its height, stabbing the Egyptian straight through his neck. The blow had so much force that the knife cut all the way through, its point sticking out at the other end of the hapless Egyptian's throat. Blood burst forth from the assassin's mouth and neck. Sati stepped back as the Egyptian drowned in his own blood. Swath was staring at this strange woman, the sneer wiped off his face. She had killed two of his assassins one-on-one, in a free and fair fight. She was bleeding desperately. And yet she stood tall and proud. Sati, meanwhile, was breathing slowly, trying to calm her rapidly beating heart. She had been cut up in too many places. A pulsating heart would work against her, pumping more blood out of her body. She also needed to conserve her energy for the duels that were to come. She looked at the knife buried deep in her abdomen. It hadn't penetrated any vital organ. The only danger was the continuous bleeding. She spread out her feet, took a deep breath, held the knife's handle and yanked it out. She didn't flinch or make any sound of pain while doing so. "Who is this woman?" asked a stunned assassin standing next to Swath. Sati bent down, ripped a part of the bloodied cloak of the assassin she had just killed, and bandaged it tightly around her abdomen. It staunched the blood flow. While doing so, she'd seen from the corner of her eye that the Meluhans who were running towered sure were probably a third of the way through. She knew she couldn't stop the duels. Now she had seen the killers. They couldn't leave her alive. Her only chance was to continue dueling and hope that she would still be breathing when the Meluhans reached her. Sati drew her sword. "Who's next?" Another assassin stepped forward. "No," said Swath. The assassin stepped back. "She's mine," said Swath, drawing one of his curved swords. Swath didn't approach Sati with both his curved swords. That would have been unfair. According to the rules of Aden, since Sati had only one sword hand, he held the sword forward in his right hand. As he neared Sati, he started swinging the sword around, building it into a stunning circle of death just ahead of him, moving inexorably towards her. Even as Swath's sword whirred closer, Sati began to step back slowly. She suddenly thrust her sword forward quickly, deep into the ring of the circling blade of Swath, inflicting a serious cut on the Egyptian's shoulder. She pulled her sword back just as rapidly, before Swath's circling blade could come back to deflect her sword. The wound must have hurt, but Swath didn't flinch. He smiled. He'd never met anyone with the ability to penetrate his sword's circle of death. This woman is talented. Swath stopped circling his sword and held it in a traditional sword fighter stance. He stepped forward, swinging viciously from the right. Sati bent low to avoid the blow and thrust her blade at Swath's arm, causing a superficial cut. But Swath suddenly reversed the direction of his blade, slashing hard across Sati's shoulder. Sati swerved back just in time, reducing the threat of what could have been a devastating blow. Swath's sword grazed her right arm and shoulder. Sati growled in fury and stabbed with such rapid force that a surprised Swath had to jump back. Swath stepped back even further. This woman was a very skilled warrior. His standard tactics would not work. He decided to keep his distance, pointing his sword forward, thinking of what could be a good move against her. Sati remained stationary, conserving her strength. She couldn't afford to move too much for fear of increasing the blood loss from her numerous wounds. Also, she was playing for time. She didn't mind. A few moments of reprieve. An idea struck Swath. Sati was primarily injured on her left side. This would impair her movements in that direction. He quickly took a giant step forward and swung viciously. From his right, Sati twisted to the left and swung her blade up to block Swath's strike. The Egyptian could see that the movement had made blood spurt out of her wounded abdomen. As Sati stabbed at Swath again, she stepped a little to the left to improve her angle. But Swath had anticipated her move. He stepped further to his right and kept on swinging again and again from that awkward angle. The intense pain of continuously turning leftwards forced Sati to take a gamble. She pirouetted suddenly and swung her sword in a great arc from her right, hoping to decapitate him. But this was exactly what Swath had expected. He ducked low and stepped forward rapidly, easily avoiding Sati's strike. At the same time, he brought his sword up in a low, brutal jab. His curved sword with its serrated edges went right through Sati's abdomen, ripping almost every single vital organ. Her intestines, stomach, kidney and liver were slashed through viciously. A paralyzed Sati, her face twisted in agony, lay impaled on Swath's curved sword. Her own blade fell from her hand. The Egyptian bent back, used the leverage and rammed his sword in even further, till its point burst through to the other side, piercing her shattered back. "Not bad," said Swath, twisting his blade as he pulled it out of Sati, ripping her organs to ribbons. "Not bad for a woman." Sati collapsed to the ground, her body shivering as dark blood began to pool on the ground around her. She knew she was going to die. It was only a matter of time. The blood flow couldn't be staunched now. Her vital internal organs and the massive numbers of blood vessels in them had been mortally damaged. But she also knew something else very clearly. She wouldn't die lying on the ground, slowly bleeding to death. She would die like a Meluhan. She would die with her head held high. She lifted her quivering right hand and reached for her sword. Swath stared at Sati in awe, transfixed as he watched her struggling to reach her blade. He knew that she must know she was going to die soon. And yet, her spirit hadn't been broken. Could she be the final kill? The cult of Aden had a belief that every assassin would one day meet the victim so magnificent, so worthy, that it would be impossible for the man to kill ever again. His duty would then be to give his victim an honorable death and give up his profession to spend the rest of his life worshipping that last victim. As Sati's arm flopped to her side after another vain attempt to reach her sword, Swath shook his head. It can't be a woman. This cannot be the moment. The final kill cannot be a woman. Swath turned around and screamed at his people. "Move out, you filthy cockroaches. We're leaving." The man standing next to Swath didn't obey his order. He continued to stare beyond Swath, stupefied by the awe-inspiring sight. Swath whirled around, stunned. Sati was upon one knee. She was breathing rapidly, forcing some strength into her debilitated body. She had dug her sword into the ground, and her right hand was on its hilt as she tried to use the leverage to push herself up. She failed, took quick breaths, fired more energy into her body, and tried once more. She failed again. Then she stopped suddenly. She felt eyes boring into her. She looked up and locked eyes with Swath. Swath stared at Sati, dumbstruck. She was completely soaked in her own blood. There were cavernous wounds all over her body, and her hands were shivering with the tremendous pain she was in. Her soul must know that death was just minutes away. And yet, her eyes did not exhibit even the slightest hint of fear. She stared directly at Swath with only one expression. An expression of pure, raw, unadulterated defiance. Tears sprang into Swath's eyes as his heart felt immeasurably heavy. His mind grasped his heart's message instantly. This indeed was his final kill. He would never, ever, kill again. Swath knew what he had to do. He drew both his curved swords, held them high by the hilt and thrust them in a downward motion. In a flash, the swords were buried in the ground. For the last time, he looked at both the half-buried, bloodied swords that had served him so well. He would never use them again. He went down on one knee, pulled his shoulders back to give himself leverage and then slammed the hilts with his palms in an outward motion, snapping both blades in two. He then got up, pulled back his hood and removed his mask. Such he could see the tattoo of a black fireball with rays streaming out on the bridge of his nose. Swath reached behind and pulled out a sword from a scabbard tied across his back. Unlike all his other weapons, this sword was marked. It was marked with the name of their god, Aiden. Below that had been inscribed the name of the devotee, Swath. The blade had never been used before. It had but one purpose alone, to taste the blood of the final victim. Thereafter, the sword would never be used again. It would be worshipped by Swath and his descendants. Swath bowed low before Sati, pointed at the black tattoo on the bridge of his nose and repeated an ancient vow. The fire of Aten shall consume you, and the honor of putting out your fire shall purify me. Sati didn't move. She didn't flinch. She continued to stare silently at Swath. Swath went down on one knee. He had to give Sati an honorable death. Beheading her was out of the question. He pointed his sword at her heart, holding the hilt with his thumb facing up. He pressed his other hand into the back of the hilt to provide support. Ready in every way, Swath stared back at Sati, at a face that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life, and whispered, "Killing you shall be my life's honor, my lady." Na A loud scream came wafting in from the distance. An arrow whizzed past and pierced Swath's hand. As his sword dropped to the ground, a surprised Swath turned to find another arrow flying straight into his shoulder. "Run!" screamed the assassins. One of them picked up Swath and started dragging him along. "No!" roared Swath, struggling against his people, who were bodily carrying him back. Not killing the final victim was one of the greatest sins for the followers of Aiden. But his people wouldn't leave him behind. Nearly 1,000 Meluhans had reached Sati, a desperately distraught Daksha and Virini in the lead. "Zadii!" screamed Daksha, his face twisted in agony. "Don't touch me!" bellowed Sati as she collapsed to the ground. Daksha buckled, crying inconsolably, digging his nails into his face. "Sati!" screamed Virini as she lifted her daughter into her arms. "Ma!" whispered Sati. "Don't talk. Relax," cried Virini, before frantically looking back. "Get the doctors. Now!" "Ma! Be quiet, my child. Ma, my time has come. No. No. We'll save you. We'll save you. Ma, listen to me," said Sati. "My child. My body will be handed over to Shiva. Nothing will happen to you," sobbed Virini. The Queen of Meluha turned around once again. "Will someone get the doctors? Now!" Sati held her mother's face with surprising strength. "Promise me. Only to Shiva." "Sati. Promise me." "Yes, my child, I promise. And, both Ganesh and Kartik will light my pyre. You are not going to die. Both Ganesh and Kartik. Promise me." "Yes, yes. I promise." Sati slowed her breathing down. She had heard what she needed to. She blocked out the weeping she could hear all around her. She rested her head in her mother's lap and looked towards the peace conference building. The doors were open. Lord Ram and Lady Sitar's idols were clearly visible. She could feel their kind and welcoming eyes upon her. She would be back with them soon. A sudden wind picked up, swirling dust particles and leaves lying around her on the ground. Sati gazed at the swirl. The particles appeared to form a figure. She stared hard. As Shiva's image seemed to emerge, she remembered the promise she had made to him, that she would see him when he returned. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The wind died down just as suddenly. Sati could feel her vision blurring. Blackness appeared to be taking over. Her vision seemed to recede into a slowly reducing circle, with darkness all around it. The wind burst into life once again. The dust particles and leaves rose in an encore and showed Sati the vision she wanted to die with, the love of her life, her Shiva. "I'll be waiting for you, my love." Thinking of her Shiva, Sati let her last breath slip quietly out of her body.